With every new Mission Impossible movie, Tom Cruise puts his life on the line for our entertainment. Ever since the fourth film in 2011, the marketing for these films has even begun to revolve around the enormous practical stunts he performs for our viewing pleasure, whether hanging off the side of an airplane or drifting cars through the streets of Rome with one hand. But there's one kind of stunt that recurs across the entire series, a stunt that each successive Mission Impossible has tried to recreate in some fashion to different degrees of success. We're talking, of course, about the drop. Now, there are plenty of times when Cruise falls and plummets during the series, but the kind of stunts we're talking about are the ones where falling is the entire point of the mission. Ever since Brian De Palma's original in 1996, there's been some variation on this theme, whether as a direct callback or as an attempt to one-up a previous film. Each version of the drop, though, is also representative of what its respective movie is trying to achieve. You could practically trace the journey of the series through its stunts, and through these drop stunts specifically. From the stylistic approach of each director to how the franchise has pretty much become a vehicle for Cruise's death-defying exhibitions. But every time Cruise drops from a certain height, it's the kind of controlled chaos that can make or break these movies, the type of scenes that make all the difference between forgettable and iconic, where a team of elite spies, shot by an equally elite team of filmmakers and stunt people, brings the impossible to life. There aren't many action beats that instantly lodge themselves in the collective consciousness. The last one was probably from The Matrix back in 1999. But before that, one of the most referenced and widely recognized action moments, which continues to be parodied to this day, came from Brian De Palma's Mission Impossible, the 1996 adaptation of the TV series from the 1960s. A far cry from the whiz-bang sequels of today, the original movie was a perfect fit for De Palma, the director of Dressed to Kill and Blowout, who was hired upon Cruise's suggestion. The film veers between a sexy psychological thriller and a paranoid political saga, and its grand centerpiece sees Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt trying to steal a list of covert agents from within the heart of his own government's intelligence. It's morally complicated because a list like that being out in the open could endanger countless lives, but it's something Hunt has to do in order to both catch the person responsible for killing his team and to clear his own name. A reference to a scene in the 1964 film Top Copy, the cable drop sees Ethan Hunt enlisting the help of Jean Reno's Franz Krieger, who lowers him down through a vent in the ceiling and into a highly protected vault. After, the movie establishes all the different ways the heist could potentially go wrong, which itself is a riff on Rififi. The floor is so pressure sensitive that Hunt can't even afford to sweat, and the vault's alarms are also sound activated. As much as the series is tied to its bombastic music, its first major, memorable set piece unfolds in almost complete silence, maintaining its tension like a vice grip, so that when Krieger accidentally drops Hunt, creating an iconic image of disaster being narrowly averted, the only sound you can hear is your own gasp. It's a deceptively simple scene with airtight execution, not unlike the movie itself. Even if you haven't seen the first Mission Impossible, it was, well, impossible to avoid this image in the years that followed, and it would be a while before any film in the series created something with nearly this much impact. But in subsequent movies, you always got the sense that they were trying to one-up it, or at least rival it, somehow, even if the filmmaking style was a complete departure. An interesting thing about the first few Mission Impossible movies is how unique they feel, since each one was made by a wildly different director, and it doesn't get much more different from Brian De Palma than Hong Kong action virtuoso John Woo. The man behind The Killer and Hard Boiled. When the world was introduced to De Palma's claustrophobic heist film, Woo was busy making Face Off, one of the most ridiculously stylized American action films of the 1990s, a movie that I love. His next Hollywood project, the first Mission Impossible sequel, featured one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and right from the get-go, he absolutely feels like it, dangling off the side of a cliff and looking, well, awesome, for lack of a better word. There's not a better, that's the right word. Awesome. He looks awesome. It's not technically a drop, of course, but it's close. However, there's a scene late in the movie that both retreads and builds on De Palma's iconic sequence. When Hunt tries to infiltrate a secret lab housing a deadly virus by dropping from a helicopter through a series of closing vents. It's a much bigger set piece, and it speaks to many of the differences between the first two movies, and between Woo's offbeat entry and the series as a whole. Mission Impossible 2 often feels like it doesn't fit with the rest of the franchise, and nowhere is that more apparent than in this version of the drop. It has all the right elements, but the way they're assembled leaves it feeling like less than the sum of its admittedly eye-catching parts. It's a drop for the sake of a drop. Woo is generally an incredible stylist, maybe the man most responsible for what we think of as cool in modern action movies. And in Mission Impossible 2, his aesthetic approach is on full display, but for a series all about heists, spies, and the cascading tension of what happens next, it sometimes feels like Woo is maybe not the best fit for this material, other than making Cruise look like the megastar he is. In Mission Impossible 2, each individual moment arrives with maximum emphasis, making the characters and scenarios look as alluring as possible, often through slow motion. But that doesn't always work for a heist sequence that, in theory, relies on building tension across a series of shots, rather than emphasizing the power of the frame during individual shots alone. Which is why the heist sequence in MI2, despite being a major escalation from the first film, doesn't have the same staying power, despite featuring similar beats. The filmmaking is rarely about building on what's happening at that very second, which poses a bit of a problem when your goal is to cut to the next cool moment instead of taking your time. JJ Abrams is a name familiar to many viewers today since he relaunched both Star Trek and Star Wars for modern viewers. Back in 2006, the Lost and Alias creator was just starting out in feature films, but his shaky, handheld style and his love of mystery box storytelling arrived pretty much full-formed, for better or worse. Mission Impossible 3 sees Ethan Hunt trying to live a normal life before being swept up in the kind of chaotic action that actually benefits from Abrams' frenetic approach, though it all centers on a superweapon known as the Rabbit's Foot, which we actually never learn anything about.
Rabbit's Foot.
The Rabbit's Foot.
Rabbit's Foot.
Ever since taking on major sci-fi properties, it's been clear that Abrams loves a good callback, even when it doesn't quite fit.
Khan.
The same is kind of true for Mission Impossible, where things feel slightly out of place.
Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall.
Early into Hunt's return to the field, he has to block a security camera, after which he drops off a ledge and lands in a way that pays homage to his iconic moment from 10 years prior. Now, ignoring the fact that he originally landed this way by accident, this isn't an altogether terrible throwback, even if it doesn't quite make sense, because it tells the audience that the Ethan Hunt they remember is back in full force. But the movie's real take on the drop, its own unique version of the stunt, arrives later on, in a way that feels similar to the second movie. And, like the second movie, it really is all about the stunt itself, rather than its place in the story. It's an even bigger escalation this time, with Hunt calculating his route and then jumping off a skyscraper before using the cable to swing his way into a different building to retrieve the mysterious Rabbit's Foot. But, like the Rabbit's Foot itself, the real story here ends up kind of obscured. We see Hunt on his way into the building via the roof, but the next time we see him, after cutting to a conversation between other characters on his team, he's already retrieved the Rabbit's Foot and he's making his way out of the building. We see him falling yet again, but the actual heist part of the sequence, the whole reason behind the drop in the first place, happens entirely off-screen. It's as if Abrams is giving us the broad idea of a big drop that one-ups its predecessors because that's what viewers have come to expect, rather than a drop that either grips its audience or innovates the concept. It's a problem found in many of Abrams' films, including this one. The story is just a loose framework for action set pieces that whiz by before you have too much time to think about them. That being said, MI3 is a fast-paced action roller coaster with an all-time great villain performance from the late Philip Seymour Hoffman.
You're not gonna hurt her.
And even though its physics don't always make sense, it did help expand on the language of the series, giving us the first extended shot of Tom Cruise running. And we do mean extended. But 3 movies in, neither of the sequels managed to create a moment as memorable as the heist in the original film, despite each director trying to one-up it in their own uniquely flashy style. Is that because it couldn't be done? Well, we might have said no if it weren't for the series' major revival 5 years later.
Light the fuse.
You probably know where this is going, but first a little backstory. After a few years of erratic behavior, Paramount was hoping Cruise would step aside from the series, and the actor they handpicked to inherit the franchise was recent Oscar nominee Jeremy Renner, who also had a similar task when replacing Matt Damon in The Bourne Legacy. Ghost Protocol was directed by Brad Bird of The Incredibles and Ratatouille, but Christopher McQuarrie, the director of every Mission Impossible movie since, was brought in for some rewrites. According to cinematographer Robert Elswit, McQuarrie moved things back in a more Cruise-centric direction. 12 years later, we're better for it, since Cruise has said he wants to keep making Mission Impossible films till he's in his 80s, but the remnants of the idea to replace him can still be felt in Ghost Protocol through several scenes that feel like they're trying to set up Renner as the series' next lead. Ghost Protocol is about how Hunt and his team try to persevere despite every bit of technology going wrong. And one such example happens in the film's third act, set in Mumbai, when Renner's William Brandt is tasked with hacking into a defense satellite. But in order to access its servers, he has to take a leap of faith and jump downward into a rotating fan in the hopes that a magnetized rover below will catch his metallic vest and make him hover. If the goal was to make him the series' new Tom Cruise, then what better way to do that than by placing him in a situation similar to the iconic original? After he drops, the movie has him float in suspended animation similar to Ethan Hunt for an extended period, and this probably would have worked to make him feel like a worthy replacement if it weren't for Cruise himself outdoing it earlier in the movie. For the first time since 1996, Mission Impossible managed to create an image as iconic and instantly recognizable as the original drop. And it also marked a turning point in the way these movies were sold to the general public. Leading up to the release, the trailer blitz was focused entirely around a single sentiment. Yes, what you're seeing is real, and yes, Tom Cruise really is crazy enough to actually scale the Burj Khalifa. Like the movie itself, in which the team works within narrow constraints to get a hold of nuclear codes, shooting this sequence proved to be a race against the clock, since the IMAX cameras could only hold so much film stock. The crew helicopters could only remain in the air for so long, and Cruise could only remain suspended for a limited time before his harness cut off the blood supply to his legs. Thankfully, everything went right, and the result is a nail-biting sequence in which everything goes awry, forcing Hunt to drop down from the tallest building in the world and swing around to an open window. If you're going to go big, you may as well go as big as humanly possible and deal with the risks as they arise, a credo that runs both through the making of this scene and through the film as a whole, which resulted in the series being revitalized with a brand new mission statement. Despite what the studio originally envisioned, Ghost Protocol pretty much guaranteed that Cruise was here to stay, and it turned out Chris McQuarrie was here to stay with him. After McQuarrie and Cruise worked together on Jack Reacher in 2012, McQuarrie took the Mission Impossible director's chair, making him the 5th different filmmaker to helm an installment, but the first to make the series sort of self-reflexive. His version of Ethan Hunt is both completely crazy, but also kind of a genius, to the point that he builds himself a metaphorical plot armor by memorizing all the information the villain needs. As Alec Baldwin's character puts it,
Hunt is the living manifestation of destiny.
And because he's the living manifestation of destiny, everything that can go wrong will go wrong, but he'll still somehow come out on top, mostly thanks to his own innovation, planning, and tireless dedication, but partially thanks to luck. It's an extension of the previous movie's central theme, which sees the team's tech constantly fail, forcing them to improvise, only this time things get significantly worse, forcing Hunt to prove just how much of a maniac he truly is, whether it's shooting the British Prime Minister with a tranquilizer or saving the Chancellor of Austria from 2 different assassins by shooting the Chancellor of Austria. The film's big drop comes once again during a heist sequence where Hunt has to install a security profile so Benji can walk in and steal information undetected. But this time, it's not just about falling, but about dropping down into a tank of water and holding his breath. It isn't the actual drop that matters, even though the image of Hunt plummeting into a dark void is pretty stunning. Rather, it's the tension of Murphy's Law in action once he's down there. Everything that can go wrong does, leaving him to make a lucky choice between 2 identical security profiles. Not only that, the drop this time actually kills him. At least for a few minutes, though it's not actually the first time that's happened to him. Hunt is a character who tries to prepare for any and every eventuality, going to extreme lengths to pull off his plans even after things go off the rails. Which is exactly the way Cruise approaches these movies. For the tank sequence, he ended up learning to hold his breath for up to 6 minutes. When the movie's conclusion wasn't working, he sat down with McQuarrie and halted production to try and rework the ending. For Hunt and for Cruise, it's all about more. Bigger, crazier, more tightly wound, even if it means getting by the skin of your teeth. And that is why Rogue Nation is such a thrill ride. Like the drop into the enormous tank, the film pushes Hunt right up to the limit, sometimes even past it, to see how he'll respond. And if Cruise wants to make things difficult for himself for our viewing pleasure, who the hell are we to stop him? After hanging off the side of the tallest building in the world and then hanging off the side of an airplane, there was really only one place left to go. Not hanging off at all, as Cruise jumps out of the sky and the camera captures it all up close. For the 6th movie, Mission Impossible Fallout, McQuarrie became the first filmmaker to ever return to the series, leaving both him and Cruise with a lot to prove. In an era increasingly dominated by digital effects, they tried to stick to practical stunt work as much as possible, even if it was more difficult and dangerous to pull off. It's also a theme that works itself into the story, with Cruise's CIA handler, Agent Walker, constantly trying to take shortcuts to make things more efficient through brute force. But for Hunt, the best way, and the way that keeps everyone alive, is always just a little bit harder. But it's what he's willing to do.
If you have a problem with my methods, you can always stay behind.
By this point in the series, Cruise had been a producer on every single film, so while this was McQuarrie's 2nd entry, it was also Cruise's 6th. And as a fan of pushing practical stunt work to the limit, whether flying real fighter jets on Top Gun Maverick or breaking his own ankle on this movie, the Mission Impossible films began to feel like a distillation of Cruise's filmmaking credo, starting with the Burj Khalifa sequence. While making Fallout, the team landed on the Halo jump, or high altitude, low open jump, as a creative way to get Hunt to Paris, where much of the story takes place. It works to make his arrival one of the most tension-filled sequences in all of Hollywood action cinema, with a camera leading Cruise out of an airplane and following him as he drops out of the sky. At this point in the series, a bigger and more audacious stunt is practically an expectation, the way the IMF's rival organization, the Syndicate, keeps escalating their threats of nuclear war and global meltdown. So, by the time the series gets to Fallout and its astonishing Halo scene, this sort of escalation is both completely surprising and yet completely inevitable. Unfortunately, its story-first approach is one the next film wouldn't necessarily follow, even though the result is still unthinkably cool.
This is far and away the most dangerous thing we've ever attempted.
The first of a 2-part grand finale, Dead Reckoning Part 1 was also sold around the idea of a single, mind-bogglingly dangerous stunt in which Cruise rides a motorcycle off a cliff without a harness and opens a parachute in the nick of time, just because he can. In fact, that's pretty much how Cruise and McQuarrie came up with the sequence. Something on Cruise's wish list was riding a bike off a mountain into a base jump.
Wanted to do it since I was a little kid.
It was because of this desire that the cliff jump sequence was born, and it was the first thing they ever filmed for Dead Reckoning. Fortunately, what you see in the trailers is what you get, since the payoff to this drop isn't necessarily the most satisfying from a story standpoint. However, thematically, you can also see where it fits in with Cruise's own outlook on tactile practical filming and his anti-digital crusade. Dead Reckoning Part 1 is about Hunt facing off against a timely villain that's also plaguing the way Hollywood movies are made, a deadly, algorithmic AI, which he has to combat with practical stunt work. In essence, the idea for the stunt is the story, and while the film doesn't quite live up to its predecessors, scenes like the cliff drop feel like an exhilarating showcase for why letting Cruise do whatever the hell he wants is an exciting narrative all on its own. At this point, the Mission Impossible films are kind of like stunt documentaries, or even the Jackass movies. Once Dead Reckoning starts building to the cliff jump, you can feel every muscle in your body tense up, finally tightening when a 60-year-old Cruise rides off a mountain and starts falling out of the sky, in a shot that lasts for a scarily long time. Whatever the stunt's place in the larger narrative, it's one that Cruise and the filmmakers have managed to turn into a main event, much like the last 3 films. Because when it comes to falling, whether it's out of a vent or out of the sky, Hunt, and by extension Cruise, makes the stunt itself the story, and much of the tension now stems from the question of whether he's really crazy enough to do it for real. The answer, as scary as it may be, is usually yes.
It all comes down to one thing: the audience.
Drop after drop, Cruise has gone to jaw-dropping lengths for our entertainment, and it doesn't seem like he's going to stop anytime soon.